Bonjour, bienvenue à tous ceux qui ont déjà réussi à passer les contrôles. Ces belles images nous mettent déjà dans l'esprit de la résonance. Vous avez même vu un petit peu de neige, très cher au cœur de Hartmut Rosa. Voilà, juste un mot, c'est la première fois de bienvenue. D'abord, c'est la première fois que Philonomiste est partenaire des entrepreneurs d'avenir pour ce Parlement. Je remercie vraiment Jacques, Mylène et leur équipe de nous avoir fait confiance, notamment sur une idée qui n'est pas si habituelle ici, qui est d'avoir une salle vraiment pour une rencontre avec un philosophe important. Et dans la petite liste qu'on a proposée, on avait proposé Hartmut Rosa sans trop y croire. Et non seulement l'équipe du Parlement immédiatement a dit « Ah oui, absolument ». La plus grande surprise, c'est que le philosophe de l'indisponibilité, qu'on a appelé il y a quelques mois, s'est rendu disponible pour venir nous voir expressément. Et de la résonance avant tout et de l'accélération, c'est sans doute ces sujets que vous connaissez, mais aussi de l'indisponibilité qui est le thème de son dernier livre. Juste un mot sur Philonomiste. C'est notre projet, notre activité, c'est d'amener la philosophie, si on veut, de la rendre disponible, en tout cas de la faire résonner en entreprise. Et nous le faisons avec deux choses, un média, un site web qui s'appelle philonomiste.com tout simplement, qui a une rédaction dirigée par Anne-Sophie Moreau, ici présente, qui va animer la rencontre. Et on trouve des articles, et notamment des vidéos, une vidéo sur la résonance que nous allons projeter dans quelques secondes. Et puis une activité de conférence qui vraiment fait entrer la philosophie en entreprise, de formation, d'ateliers, et aussi une plateforme pour les entreprises qui permet de rendre ces contenus philosophiques disponibles pour l'ensemble des collaborateurs, dans un esprit vraiment de transformation de l'entreprise et de diffuser l'intelligence et de diffuser aussi le questionnement dans l'entreprise, qui est dirigé et animé par une équipe qui est là aussi, avec notamment ici Jules Véran, Borromée, Quentin, pour peut-être rencontrer après. Voilà, j'en dis pas plus, je laisse la parole à Anne-Sophie Moreau et à Hartmut Rosa qui va nous rejoindre. Hartmut, please join us on the stage. Thank you.
Bonjour. Alors, je vous remercie d'abord d'être venus si nombreux en cette heure matinale à Porte de la Muette. Alors, j'espère que ce matin, vous serez très attentifs et résonnants. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par résonnant? C'est ce que Hartmut Rosa va nous expliquer dans quelques minutes, parce que nous sommes ici pour découvrir la pensée de l'auteur qu'on connaît. Pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, on vous connaît surtout comme le grand théoricien d'abord de l'accélération et ensuite de la résonance. Ce concept, Hartmut Rosa l'a forgé pour expliquer la maladie de la modernité tardive, c'est-à-dire l'accélération et surtout ce qu'il appelle la crise généralisée des relations. Pour Hartmut Rosa, nous avons perdu le contact avec le monde, avec la nature, avec les autres, avec nous-mêmes. Nous allons essayer de comprendre ensemble ce que ça veut dire, mais évidemment, vous imaginerez que pour quelqu'un qui a conçu ce concept de résonance et d'écho, il n'appréciera pas de parler tout seul aujourd'hui. Il voudra avoir l'écho de la salle et comprendre aussi avec vous en quoi ces propos résonnent dans nos vies, à vous, à moi, parce que nous allons essayer pendant cette heure et demie que nous allons passer ensemble d'appliquer ce concept à nos vies. Je dis bien à nos vies, car si nous sommes ici pour penser donc l'avenir du capitalisme, pour humaniser le progrès, c'est avant tout en changeant notre rapport à notre travail, en tout cas c'est notre conviction chez Philonomiste, que nous aurons une chance de changer le monde. Et donc pour que ces questions résonnent en chacun de nous, je vais avoir besoin de vous, et je vous préviens dès maintenant, puisque après une petite vidéo d'introduction sur la pensée de Hartmut Rosa et après la conférence que vous avez la gentillesse de nous donner, je vous poserai à vous quelques questions, et surtout je vous demanderai, je vais vous passer le micro, et je vous demanderai de témoigner. Et donc je vous pose déjà une question qui va vous sembler peut-être un peu mystérieuse avant la présentation, mais à laquelle vous pourrez réfléchir pendant l'exposé, à savoir, est-ce que vous vous êtes déjà retrouvé dans votre vie professionnelle personnel dans des situations de résonance ou bien de non-résonance. Vous verrez que vous comprendrez, en tout cas je l'espère, vous nous direz ce que vous associez à ce concept après l'exposé. Alors je vais demander à la régie de lancer la petite vidéo d'introduction.
Vous envoyez des emails auxquels personne ne répond. Votre entreprise épuise les ressources naturelles sans améliorer la société. Vous courez partout, mais vos tâches s'accumulent. Bref, vous êtes pris dans ce que le philosophe et sociologue allemand Hartmut Rosa appelle l'accélération. Pour Rosa, le propre de nos sociétés modernes, c'est qu'elles nous soumettent à une logique de croissance illimitée. Que ce soit au travail, en politique ou dans notre vie privée, nous cherchons en permanence à en faire toujours plus. Plus de sport, plus de progrès techniques, plus de loisirs, on cherche même à optimiser nos vacances. Tout se passe comme si on avait peur de ce qui pourrait se passer si on arrêtait d'augmenter notre productivité. Un peu comme si on était sur un vélo et qu'on risquait de tomber si on cessait de pédaler. Mais quelle est la solution ? Faire une pause ? Prendre ses RTT pour faire le plein d'énergie et recommencer à courir dès la rentrée ? Non. Pourquoi ? Parce que ce n'est pas la vitesse en elle-même qui pose problème. Pour Rosa, la solution, ce n'est pas la lenteur, mais la résonance. D'après lui, nous vivons une crise profonde de nos relations. Nous avons perdu le contact à la fois avec la nature, avec nous-mêmes et avec les autres. Cela se traduit par la crise écologique, mais aussi par le rapport aliéné que nous entretenons avec nous-mêmes et avec autrui. On cherche à tout contrôler, en mesurant le nombre de pas qu'on fait au quotidien, ou encore en voulant à tout prix évaluer nos performances pour nous situer dans la compétition permanente qui règne entre nous. Ce sont les conditions idéales pour le burn-out, cet état que Rosa décrit ainsi. Dehors, tout est mort, gris, froid et vide. Et en moi aussi, tout est muet et sourd. Ce sentiment d'absurdité nous prend quand plus rien ne nous parle, quand nous avons perdu toute résonance avec le monde. Or, si le monde ne nous parle plus, c'est parce que nous le considérons comme une ressource infinie et exploitable à l'envi par la technique. À force d'avoir accès à tout, on sent bien qu'on ne profite plus des choses. Pourquoi ? Parce que c'est l'indisponibilité du monde qui suscite notre désir. On a beau stocker de la musique sur Spotify, c'est une mélodie entendue par hasard dans le métro qui nous bouleversera le plus. Mais revenons au travail. Qu'est-ce qui peut, dans notre manière d'exercer notre activité, rendre notre rapport au monde moins aliénant ? Pour Rosa, on est en résonance quand on s'adresse au monde et qu'il nous répond. Ça peut paraître un peu ésotérique, mais ce n'est pas si compliqué. Raisonner au travail, c'est accepter d'être affecté, de se laisser surprendre et d'improviser, de se confronter à la résistance du matériau, d'être à l'écoute d'une idée qui nous vient lors d'une discussion sans qu'on s'y attende. Ça implique aussi de refuser de gâcher le plaisir du travail bien fait au nom des impératifs de productivité. Au fond, il s'agit simplement d'admettre que tout n'apparaît pas sur commande et que ni la nature, ni nos collègues ne sont des ressources disponibles et manipulables à merci.
Merci. Oui, parce que je crois que ça ne s'arrête pas. Donc merci. Alors, Hartmut Rosa, d'abord je vais parler en quelques mots de votre vie et de votre parcours. Vous êtes né en Allemagne, en Forêt-Noire, la région de Martin Heidegger, le philosophe de l'authenticité, Eigentlichkeit. Vous en avez gardé une passion pour la marche et pour les montagnes, ces géants silencieux dont vous dites souvent qu'ils vous parlent. Après avoir étudié la philosophie à l'université de Fribourg en Brisgau, Freiburg, Vous poursuivez votre cursus à la London School of Economics. C'est là que vous découvrez, entre guillemets, la modernité, du moins le rythme effréné de la vie urbaine. Vous vous tournez alors vers la sociologie, l'école de Francfort et sa théorie critique, pour comprendre le sentiment d'aliénation qui pèse sur nos existences dans la société capitaliste. Vous enseignez aujourd'hui à l'université d'Iéna. C'est votre grand livre, Accélération, une critique sociale du temps, paru à la découverte en 2010 en France, qui vous a valu la reconnaissance mondiale. Vous y décrivez un monde pris dans une dynamique sans fin, celle de l'accélération. Mais rapidement, vous vous rendez compte que vous ne souhaitez pas rester cantonné à cette posture critique qui ne suggère aucune solution à cette situation terrible d'aliénation que vous décrivez. Vous êtes par ailleurs un peu agacé par les incompréhensions sur votre premier livre. On vous prend pour le philosophe de la lenteur, du ralentissement, ce que vous n'êtes pas. Vous aimez les rythmes rapides, vous qui, enfant, avez appris à jouer de la batterie. C'est bien cela. Bref, les stages de yoga, ce n'est pas votre truc. Vous cherchez donc une autre piste. Ce sera la résonance, auquel vous dédiez un essai fouillé, Résonance, une sociologie de notre relation au monde, traduit chez La Découverte. Enfin, votre dernier essai, Rendre le monde indisponible, paru aussi chez La Découverte et qui vient tout juste de sortir, et que je vous recommande chaudement parce que c'est un essai court, précis, enlevé, qui résume aussi très bien l'ensemble de votre œuvre, qui peut paraître difficile à aborder au premier abord, mais je vous laisse exposer tout cela en détail. Merci.
Ça marche, oui. Merci beaucoup à Anne-Sophie et aussi à Fabrice pour l'invitation. Je suis très heureux d'être ici à cette conférence. Je crois que c'est très intéressant. Et merci beaucoup aux philologistes. Je voudrais parler en français, mais malheureusement, je ne peux pas le faire. Le français n'est pas assez bien. Je suis vraiment désolé. J'essaie de l'améliorer, mais c'est une langue très difficile. C'est pourquoi il me faut parler en anglais. Je vous demandais de me pardonner.
J'en profite pour faire une précision. Il y a deux canaux si vous devez avoir reçu des casques. En tout cas, n'hésitez pas à les demander si vous ne les avez pas. Le canal 1 est pour les anglophones, c'est-à-dire qu'on traduit vers l'anglais. Le canal 2 est pour les francophones. On vous traduira donc les propos de Hartmut Rosa en français.
Yes, as Anne-Sophie has already told you, my theory has been about it had a lot to do with an interpretation of modern society, and the insight was, the starting point was that it is really characterized by an increase in speed, by acceleration. Right? You can really say from the 18th century on until today, it's a permanent increase in the speed, technological speed, but also social speed. It really is. Modernization is setting the world in motion. You actually see it when you think of the way in which we literally, materially made the world spin faster, right? With first with the steamships, for example, then with the railways. There were more and more railways, more and more tracks. It's a process going on until today. When you think of places like China or India or Japan, more trains, longer trains, faster trains. Then the cars came up, more cars. It's until today, more cars, bigger cars, the trucks, right, going on. And even inside cities, more trams, more buses, more taxis. It's really amazing. When you look at the data, you clearly see we are about to set the world in motion. And then, of course, it went on with the airplanes, right? More and more airplanes, more passengers, but also more goods. And it's even on the oceans, more ships. And so I always tell my students, think of maybe aliens watching us. What would they see? they would really see that we set the world in motion with the cars, the trains, the planes, the ships, right? And even the vélo, le vélo, the bicycle, it's a modern invention because people wanted to go fast, right? So we could have invented it much earlier, but that creates also a number of problems. So I don't want to talk for too long. I just give you the broad outline of what I think a problem is, not just in living but also in working conditions. And of course what we need, and you already pointed at this, I think it's not enough to just describe and criticize society. I mean, there's so many criticisms of the modern capitalist whatever world in critical theory. One author after the other presents his or her critique. But I think, and people like Adorno would have been very skeptical about it, but I think we need to ask ourselves, what was it that we dreamt of? What was the promise of modernity? Right? Why is this attractive? What can progress mean in today's world? Right? So I want to at first give you a brief definition. Number one, what is modern society? It's just in 2 sentences, right? A redescription of acceleration. I do it with the concept of dynamic stabilization. Then I want to look at how do we live today. You already saw it in the short video, right? I like that very much, right? The video we had in the beginning, right? But my claim there is that we live in a mode of aggression towards the world, right? That's kind of consequence of this process of acceleration. And then in the third step, I want to briefly show why this is creating problems, environmental problems, political problems, but also individual problems. People are not as happy as they should be after 250 years of progress, right? So then the question, of course, is how could we do it differently? What could be the yardstick, the idea of a good life in today's world? And I will finish with a very short description of what I think, what progress could mean in late modern society, société tardive, I think you call it in French. So when I wrote the acceleration stuff, right, there always was the question, why is it that this drive forwards, increase of speed and of quantity and so on, and technology, what is driving it, right? And of course there are kind of 2 answers. One is because we are so greedy. Modern subjects never have enough. They always want more, higher, faster. But my answer is, it's not so much that, right? I mean, it was certainly a driving element, and it still is in some aspects. But we have to understand that for entrepreneurs, for example, the situation is not that they never have enough. The situation is that they need to be faster, more efficient, more productive in order to keep what they have. Right? I call this dynamic stabilization, and you see the definition here on the slides. Right? My claim is that a modern society, but you could also even say a modern enterprise, a modern company, is defined by the fact that it structurally needs to increase, to speed up, to grow, to be innovative in order to keep its place, actually to keep its institutional structure. Right? I mean, in the economic world, in macro sociology, you see it very easily, right? A modern society, say France, needs somehow to speed up, actually, right? To accelerate, to grow, to be innovative, productive, efficient, to optimize in order to keep its institutional structure. And that does not only mean to keep the number of jobs and companies, but also to pay for the pensions, right, which I understand are now heavily contested in France, but also to keep the educational system, to keep the infrastructure, to pay for the sick, right, the health insurance and so on, and even the arts and so on. A conference like this, you can only have if every year you run a bit faster than before. Right? That's my definition of dynamic stabilization. A modern society can only stay as it is, keep its pension schemes, educational system, health system, and so on, if it increases every year. And of course, this leads to a situation where you know you have to run faster and faster each year just to stay where you are. Right? And this logic, I mean, I don't have 3 hours, which I would need to explain it, because this macro logic, the societal logic, does not easily translate into our individual existence. But through the processes of competition and optimization, it does translate into our lives, right? It means that you and I, we have to run faster next year in order not to fall behind or not to fall back. And of course, this creates a problem for progress. Right? So you ask, so there's a kind of split in the logic of progress. The progress will go on in the sense of, yes, next year you will produce more. Next year you will have faster technologies. Next year you will do more in a year than you do this year. So in that sense you still have progress, right? But this progress only serves to keep what you have. There's always the danger that you slide back because you're not fast enough. The French are not working hard enough. They are not optimizing enough. They are not innovative and creative enough. The Chinese never sleep also, or the Koreans also. So there's a kind of split in this sense of progress. Yes, faster, more, and more efficient, but it doesn't mean that our lives get better, right? At least not easily. And this is because this logic of dynamic stabilization, right? It kind of brings us into what I call the mode of aggression. Right? And I always claim that when you wake up in the morning, you're already in a kind of mode of aggression. You actually see it in the way you wake up, because you don't wait until you wake up because the sun comes up or some animals awake you or so. But the alarm clock is ringing, right? We call it alarm clock. Alarm, oh, I have to get the bus, I have to go to the conference, whatever it is, right? So right at the beginning, you kind of jump at the world. I have to do this, I have to get that, oh, I have to call him, I have to check on the cell phone what happened or so on. Right? So it's already from minute one, so to speak, the way you relate to actually your body when you enter the bathroom in the morning, right, is already the kind of mode of aggression. Oh, I have to do something about this spot and about that wrinkle and about my weight and so on. And in the logic of the company, of course, it's the same, right? Oh, we have to tackle the, I don't know what it is, right, the software, and to improve the hardware and to fill in all the formulas and so on. So actually this logic, what I call the logic of the mode of aggression, right, it comes through the logic of competition. The others are faster, they do more, right? But also, of course, through the forces of optimization, get better in everything you do, right? Get faster, have faster technologies, but also try to organize the processes more efficiently in order to speed up. Because, of course, in a capitalist economy, in the logic of dynamic stabilization, time is money, right? Wherever you lose time, you kind of fall back. And I also talk about, I call it downward escalators. The fact for you as individuals and for France as a society and for your company is that it's on all levels of existence. We somehow stand on downward escalators. If you don't run uphill, right, upwards, you're kind of put down. Right? For example, I can imagine, since I believe a lot of you might be entrepreneurs, right? So, for example, you get a new hardware and a new software system in your company. Of course, this creates kind of problems because everyone has to get used to it. So you always hope, but once it really works fully, then we will have a really fast and efficient thing. Now, the problem is, of course, that after a few days, you already realize, oh, there is now a better software which we have not installed, right? There is a new virus protection which you have not installed, and there are new regulations and new rules, right? And maybe your partners in the world have other systems, so you already kind of slide down, and after a year or two, your hardware is not up to date, your software is not up to date, I don't know what it is, right? All the files you have might not be up to date, and so on, right? So there's kind of there's the permanent danger of not being on top of the ladder, right? I could talk about this for hours, but I don't have the hours. My claim is it always creates, and I'm absolutely sure that's your situation and mine, it creates what I call subjects of guilt. And by this I mean you have a to-do list, what you actually should do, right? What you could be expected expected to have done. Right? And this to-do list is always longer. It takes longer to work on it than the time you actually have. So when you fall asleep at night, right, you once again did not do everything that was expected of you, right? Because it's very, I mean, I spent a long time after the acceleration book, right, to think about why is it that the to-do list explodes. Right? It really explodes individually and for a company, right? And I think it has to do with what I call legitimate expectations. Right? For example, you enter your office and there's a number of emails and you think, oh yeah, actually I should have answered them yesterday, right? And then, for example, there is then someone comes in and says, oh, you still have this old thing, and you think, yes, actually I should have introduced the new hardware, the new software long ago. I should have read the manual, right? Then you encounter a problem and you think, I really should have read the manual. And then someone comes from the tax office, from the tax authorities, and says, oh, why did you not implement this new program or this whatever it is, and you feel actually I should have done so, right? And then you sit in a meeting, for example, and then people say, oh, did you not read the file I sent yesterday or 2 days ago? And you feel actually I should have read the file, right? And in the evening, for example, you go to your family and your wife says, you forgot the birthday of your son, for example, and you think, yeah, I really should have done that. And did you call your grandma? Oh no, once again I did not call my grandma, right? And then you finally go to the doctor because you are stressed, and he says, I told you should do 10,000 steps per day. Why did you not? And you think, oh, actually, I should have done, but I really... And then you go to the psychologist because you are close to burnout, and he says, I told you to do yoga and meditate every day. And you think, oh, yeah, it's actually true. So always... we are kind of subjects of guilt, right? Standing on downward escalators all day. But so I think individually, the drive to do more, to improve, to optimize, to get better, has kind of, and that's true for a company too, right, or for an enterprise. It has always two ends. One is that we have to run faster to keep our place, so it's actually fear of losing out, of falling backwards. But it's not just, actually a lot of entrepreneurs tell me, but that's not wholly right? We are not just the victims of speed. We want to be innovative and to find solutions and to speed up, and I think this is absolutely true. I don't want to deny it, right? I think it's, in part, it is a human thing, curiosity, right, and the capacity to innovate is our basic feature. It's a good thing, but I think the problem is that most innovations are not driven by our desire to go somewhere, but by the need. You have to come up with something new. But nevertheless, we also want to, I call this the AAA conception of the good life. We want to increase the horizon of what is available to us, of what is attainable to us, of what is achievable or what is possible. So we permanently try to increase the horizons of availability and attainability and accessibility, right? So there's also kind of positive driving force in this game. I don't want to deny that. I think this is why faster technologies are attractive, right? For example, when you walk on foot and you get your first bike, the horizon of what is available to you actually increases, and this has to do with our experience of happiness. And it further increases when you get your first moped, and when you get a car, you can actually go to Paris or to the ocean or wherever you want to go. And with the plane, you can actually go to New York or Rio de Janeiro. So it's the increase in the horizon of possibilities that is a kind of positive driving force, right? So in the end, but we don't have to go through this extensively because it takes too long, right? My claim here is that we live in a society where you have, particularly in enterprises, parametric optimization, right? So everything we do can be kind of measured in parameters, right? It's like in our individual lives. How many steps per day do you make? But you know it from if you have an enterprise, right? There are more and more benchmarks, right? What's the output? What's the inputs? What are the costs? What is the, I don't know how many levels and things you have. But you can kind of, as soon as you have a figure, a number, you can compare it with others. That's what you immediately do, right? You see what's my data, what is your data, and then you try to improve it, to optimize it. Right? Like, it's like when you think of your body, right? I can do more steps per day, but I can also I optimize the intake of calories and the burning of calories. And I can increase the blood, not increase the blood pressure, but optimize the blood pressure and all levels of my body and so on. So we live in a kind of, in the logic of parametric optimization. Now my claim is that this doesn't actually lead to the good life. It rather leads to something like burnout. And the question is, why is this? And here is now the third step. Why does this way of living, parametric optimization in a speeding up world, go wrong? And my claim is that it has a structural, it has an outside and an inside, so to speak. On the structural level, the problem is that not all segments of the world speed up or are speedable, can be accelerated in the same extent and in the same way, right? So some things speed up and the others are still slow, and that creates pressure. It creates actually the problem of desynchronization. And I believe the crisis we have in this world, the political crisis we have, but also, of course, the ecological crisis, and even the economic crisis, are actually crises of desynchronization, right? The speeds there are different speeds, and when and some systems speed up and the others stay slow, and that creates friction. So you see it most easily with respect to the environment, to nature, right? The problem is that we cut down trees at a pace which is too high for the forest to regrow, and we fish the oceans at a pace which is too high for the fish to reproduce. And you actually see it with the climate change, because the thing is, it's heating up the atmospheres, right? And heating up something means making the molecules spin faster. We actually accelerate the air, if you so like. We accelerate the atmospheric levels around us, the layers, right? So the speed up process, carbon driven on the surface of the air, is speeding up the atmosphere, and that creates a desynchronization problem, because that's kind of against the proper speeds of the climate systems as they existed so far, at least. And I also believe that what you see I call it a crisis of democracy, and I think of things like Trump, Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Salvini, many others, right? We can talk for a long time for this, but I believe it is a desynchronization problem too, because democracy is a time-consuming process. It's actually a slow process, right? It's not about taking a vote. That can be done fast, but a society that wants to self-govern, right? Give the rules according to which we live by ourselves. That means it takes time to find these rules. And the more groups there are, the more pluralistic a society gets, the longer it takes to formulate positions, to come up with options and possibilities, and then to find out the right way. So my claim is that democracy is not only time-consuming, the process of democratic making of politics, policy making, is actually slowing down, because our societies get more diverse, less conventional, right? But the markets are speeding up, and even the media are speeding up. There is desynchronization between the speed of politics and the speed of the economy. And even within the economy, you can speed up financial transactions on the financial markets to almost the speed of light, right? As you know, at the stock markets, there's trading done by algorithms. You can do that at the speed of light. But you cannot do the real economy, not even close to the speed of light, right? It takes time to build a house or to build a car, and actually or to write a book. And it actually takes time to use a house or a car or a book, right? To use a book is not to buy it, but to read it, and that is time-consuming, right? And as it is to write it, and that's the same with cars and houses and other things. So there's desynchronization between the speed of financial markets and the speed of the real economy. And I believe, to cut the long story short, that there is also kind of desynchronization between, I use the old-fashioned word here, between the speed of our soul and the speed of the economic, technological realm out there, right? Because human beings, their psyche, right, has its own proper time too, right? And we saw that in the video, right? To really appropriate the world around you, to get in touch. And people, that's what I want to say, right? We need to get in touch in a certain way, and this will be the next and almost last point already. I mean, to getting in touch is being in resonance with the world, and that has a kind of, you cannot speed that up indefinitely. If you don't do it, it leads to alienation. We had that in the video in the beginning, right? Alienation is a state where you have a large horizon of availability, attainability, and accessibility, but it doesn't talk to you, it doesn't speak to you, right? I really believe this speeding up process leads to a kind of burning up the atmosphere, a burning out from the inside, right? It's kind of logic of speed, it creates heat, and this heat is burning up the atmosphere, burning you out on the inside. You lose the capacity to really be in touch with yourselves, by the way, and with others. Of course, you can interact very quickly. What's the time? It's 5 o'clock. That's not resonance, right? Resonance has a different structure, and I'll turn to this now. What am I doing? Oh, I'm already late. I have to speed up. Okay, so let's do this. We don't need this, we need this. What is alienation's other? So that was the big book, because I thought, I don't dream of a slow world, right? Nobody would want slow computers or slow internet access or a slow fire engine or even a slow roller coaster. It's not only boring, it's dangerous. It would fall down, right? So as you said, I'm not dreaming of slowness, but I wondered what would be a good way of being in the world. And my claim is that you all have these experiences. I have it, you have it. It's when do you really feel happy? Or when do you feel happiness is a difficult word, right? I believe it's a kind of processual thing. When do we get in resonance with the world? It has 4 elements. Number 1 is that there is something that is really calling you. It's speaking to you. It moves you, right? That's the first element. So, for example, you might come to this conference very bored. The boss asked you, you have to go there, and you think, oh, it's so boring, right? And then something is calling you. It might be an idea you hear, but it might be a person sitting next to you, or it might be the space or a music you hear, for example, and all of a sudden you feel something is vibrating, right? Something is calling you. I call it affection, right? Something speaks to you. People have these experiences when they listen to music, when they walk in nature, but they also might have it during work. I really believe work is an essential sphere of resonance, and the first element is something captures me, something calls me, something affects me. But that's not enough, right? To really be in resonance with something means you have the capacity to answer it, to move outward, so to speak. So in a conference like this, resonance starts when you think, that's an interesting idea, but it doesn't have to be my idea, it can be someone's idea, or in the video. That's an interesting idea, and then you start thinking about it. That's what I mean with emotion, answering it, doing something with it, appropriating it. Right? That's when what changes your way of being in the world. Then you're no longer in a mode of aggression. You're in a mode of, so to speak, I call it positive appropriation. Something touches you, and you go outward, you answer it, and then in the third step is you're transformed, right? You don't stay the same, right? If it's an alienating experience at the conference, you go there in a bad mood and you leave as the same person, even in maybe a little more depressed mood, right? But if it becomes a resonant experience, then you somehow change. You have new ideas, and actually it even changes your psychological state of being in the world. You feel. It's not just feeling in touch. It's kind of feeling. It's like a liquefaction of our way of being in the world, right? It's not dead and cold and hard. It's somehow a kind of dynamic interplay that transforms you, and in doing that, you also transform the thing that encounters you. And that is what I wrote the last book on, Rendre le monde indisponible, because I believe one element of resonance is that you cannot engineer it, and therefore you cannot just optimize it, right? Non-engineerability would also be the word, I think it's the best English word for indisponibility. You cannot ensure that we will get in resonance, right? You might have the best intentions, I might have the best intentions, but nevertheless I somehow feel I somehow didn't get through to these people, or you feel what this guy said is somehow it's not speaking to me, right? He can go on for hours, right? So you cannot guarantee that there's resonance going on in the discussions, in whatever you have. But if there is resonance, for example, fortunately we have quite some time for discussion. And if there is resonance, you cannot predict what the outcome will be, what the result will be, right? So resonance cannot be optimized, it cannot be manufactured, you cannot instrumentally bring it about. And therefore, if there is, oh, that's the new book, you have to see it. No, you don't have to see it. Okay.
Ça, c'était le nouveau livre.
So no, let me speed up. I mean, there's just 2 points I want to make, and then I finish. The one is that there is a number of conditions for resonance to happen, and some of them have actually to do with temporality, because time pressure. You remember, this is how I started. Time pressure is actually killing resonance. When you have to catch the airplane, right, at the airport, you cannot get in resonance with the people you meet, or the music you hear, or the cat that walks along your feet or so, because you have to be fast. Don't be touched by anything. You know, resonance is a process which you cannot control. You don't know the outcome. So in a world where the to-do list is getting longer and longer, and where you permanently have to optimize things, making it better, making it more precise, making it more accountable, it gets more and more difficult to really be in resonance with each other and with the world, right? And therefore, and I promised I will finish with this, and this is the last slide. What is a good notion of progress you as entrepreneurs, the politicians, and we as individuals can work on? What is a good life? And of course, we know philosophically it's almost an unanswerable question, but nevertheless we try and try. And here's my answer, right? You cannot define it in terms of substance. I cannot say a good life is if you marry and have 3 kids, and I cannot say a good life is if you're Catholic or Protestant or Buddhist or whatever, right? So you cannot define it in terms of substance, but we can define it in terms of relationship. How do we relate to the world? What's the mode of being in the world? And my answer is, if we live in resonance with the world along 4 dimensions or 4 axes. Number 1 is social axis of resonance. Did I make a mistake here? No. Social. So that means you have to have some people at least with whom you enter into a resonant relationship. They mean something to you, and you're capable of reaching out to them. It's in love, it's in friendship, it's in politics, and maybe it's in companies too. I'm pretty sure in work, very often you have resonant social relationships. And of course, they're always in danger of being undermined by the logic of optimization. I'm really sorry, but you're sick, that's your problem, right? Either you solve it or you're fired. Then you kill the axis of resonance, right? Then you kill them for optimization. So the second, and I think this is something philosophy has not thought about enough. People do not only get in resonance with each other, they get in resonance with things, with matter, with the stuff they work on, even with the physical, the materiality. Right? My father was a baker. When he talked about the dough, you could really see and hear and feel how it was a kind of resonant relationship with the dough. He said, you have to watch it, right? You have to be careful with it. You have to give it time. But of course, he felt self-efficacy in forming it, but he said, you never know what the bread is when it comes out. So there's material resonance, particularly in work. But there's also a sense of existential resonance. This is what we are really also yearning for, what we need. A sense that at the bottom of our existence, right, at the innermost core of our being in the world, there is not a silent universe, but an answering relationship. Right? People have this experience in religion, some of them. I think that's the point of religion, right? It tells you at the heart of your existence, there is someone who hears you, who sees you, who somehow answers you, right? So the logic when you pray, it's moving inward and outward. You feel a kind of existential axis of resonance with God or with the world or whatever it is. So the existential axis of resonance does not have to be religious. It can be with nature. When you stand at the ocean, you feel physically, bodily, you feel a sense of being connected to the waves rolling in and out. Or when you watch the stars, for example. And a lot of people find this existential experience in music. They close their eyes, they move inward and outward, and they feel sound is it's sound and harmony and melody is what connects you to life, for example, right? And finally, we need to be in resonance with ourselves, right? Because you have to somehow be in resonance with your body, your psyche, and also your biographic memory and your biography as a total, right? So what is the good life? It is a life that has established axis of resonance in the social realm, in the material realm, in the existential realm, and towards the selves. And that's what I wanted to tell you at this point. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour cet exposé très complet, très vivant et très clair. Alors j'espère que vous avez profité de ce temps pour réfléchir à vos questions et à vos témoignages, parce qu'on a vraiment envie de vous entendre là-dessus. Peut-être avant de passer à vos contributions, je vais vous poser une ou deux questions pour préciser, ou en tout cas pour revoir des points qui me semblent pertinents sur cette question de la résonance au travail et en entreprise. Alors, dans votre livre sur la résonance, que j'en profite pour vous montrer, puisque je ne sais pas si je vous l'ai montré, voilà, la résonance, une sociologie de la relation au monde. Vous ouvrez votre essai sur l'histoire de deux peintres que vous comparez. Pour vous, il y a deux façons de travailler, ou en tout cas, on va dire, d'agir de manière générale. L'une en convoquant des ressources et en essayant ensuite de les utiliser, et l'autre qui serait davantage en résonance. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer ça?
Yeah, I mean, in sociology, I mean, there's a certain danger with the argument, but what I wanted to say there in sociology, and I think maybe in politics, or when we think about society, we have a kind of implicit assumption that having more resources means having a better life, right? For example, of course, we look at who has, about the money, right? Who has more money or earns more or earns less, but it's not just about money, as everyone knows. It's also about what we call cultural capital, right? Those who have better education. So we compare levels of education, but we also compare levels of social, what we call social capital, right? How many friends do you have? How many people you know? And of course, so basically with Pierre Bourdieu, whom I admire a lot, you could say modern life is very much about the capital, the different sorts of capital. Economic capital, you need money, right? And more money is better than less money. And more knowledge is better than lesser knowledge. And more social relationships, more friendships are better than less. And also there's body capital. I really believe we are obsessed with this, right? I mean, when people think about the good life, they normally think about health. And that's about how can I make my life longer, right? How can I be more healthy and so on. So there's body cap and how can I be more attractive, prettier and so on. People invest an incredible amount of emotional energy in trying to look better, trying to be healthier, trying to have more money, more friends and so on. And I wanted to say that I can imagine two people, I call them, it's two women in that case, right, who have exactly the same amount of capital on all levels. They earn the same, they have the same amount of health and so on, but nevertheless one has a kind of good life and the other doesn't, right? And the difference is it's not about resources, it's about the way they relate to what they do and the people they meet and even to their own bodies, right, for example, right? And of course the shortcut is that you say, well, if you love what you do, then you have a good life. If you hate it, you have a bad life, no matter how much you earn, right? But of course, I mean, I don't want to go that suggests that you say, oh, don't care about how much you earn, just love what you do. Even if you have a really bad job in a bad company and you're totally exploited, just love it and you'll have a good life. Of course, that's not what I wanted to say, right? I just wanted to say, because as I said, there are conditions of being in resonance. If you're exploited, or particularly if you're despised, if people look down on you, you'll probably not be in resonance with yourself and society. Right? So I didn't want to say resources don't matter. I just wanted to say they are not enough, right? We have to turn our perspective.
Et cela veut aussi dire que la séparation entre la vie privée et la vie professionnelle n'est pas la solution. C'est-à-dire, ce n'est pas en prenant des vacances qu'on va s'en sortir.
This is a very, I mean, it's a very modern and a very strange thing to make this division between life and work, right? And I mean, people have it. I find it really interesting. I mean, there's this talk about work-life balance. I could imagine also at this conference. And actually, most people have kind of given up. I find this very interesting for the present discussion in France, right? People have given up. They have lost their hope that they will have a work-life balance when, let's say, when they are in their 40s, right? Because there the to-do list is overwhelming, right? With the work you have to do and the family life and everything else. So I think they somehow have shifted to a work-age balance, right? The idea is, right now, I don't have time for life, but I will start my life once I get to retirement, right? And that's why it is so kind of a threat and a bad thing. They will now also take away the life which you will have after your work life. But
se rend compte que c'est pour ça que
I think this is a very unhealthy division anyway, right? We somehow have to really we have to change this, right? Living and working are because working is what gives you a sense of self-efficacy and resonance. So it could be a sphere of resonance, but not under the present, what I call capitalist conditions.
Dans votre dernier livre, vous réfléchissez à cette notion de disponibilité. Vous faites la distinction entre le disponible et l'atteignable. Voilà. Et alors c'est intéressant parce que vous avez toute une réflexion sur cette façon qu'on a de voir le monde comme une ressource disponible à laquelle on a de plus en plus accès. Mais vous considérez aussi qu'on considère parfois, qu'on voit parfois les gens, les personnes aussi comme des ressources disponibles. Et que nous sommes, vous notez que nous sommes au travail et partout ailleurs, en permanence face à des indisponibilités. Qu'est-ce que vous entendez par là? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner des exemples de la vie au travail?
Indisponibilité de la vie au travail.
Au travail, quand le fait d'être en permanence face à des gens, face à des personnes aussi qui ne sont pas disponibles. Peut-être à travers le télétravail, par exemple, le fait que les gens soient en permanence connectés mais ne se voient pas.
Yes, but I really think it's very interesting if one think about work. And the claim is that we always want to make things totally disponible, right? Because that's how we optimize it, right? You kind of you get the parameters, right? And then you work on it, of course. And there's always the pressure to save time and to do it more efficient and so on. But whenever work gets into a kind of resonant mode, right, you cannot really say, you cannot completely control the outcome and the time it takes, right? I mean, you see it whenever you work with people, as you said, right? For example, the teacher with the kids, right? Of course, you cannot. With PISA, I don't know, with these tests, right? I think it's done by the OECD, right? Where they test school kids, right? Of course, you can see how is the score in France, how is the score in Germany, and then you can try to improve it. The Germans have to get better in mathematics, and the French have to get better in the reading capacity or so. But when education really gets interesting and important, that's, for example, in the classroom, when there's a discussion about some really things that really matter, and that's not, you cannot fit this into parameters, right? And you cannot optimize it. And it's the same when you work with clients, right? And actually everything that's about innovation, you cannot completely make it disponible. You never know when the really interesting ideas crop up and what the outcome will be. And of course, companies like Google and others have already discovered this, right? So they try to tell people, we don't tell you when to work, we don't even tell you where to work or how to work. But then you see the kind of the clash. We just want you to be productive, but in the end, you somehow have to produce additional surplus value, right, to improve things. So I believe, and actually, I mean, we don't have to talk about Google and Silicon Valley stuff. It's true in every company, because we know this from industrial sociology. People say, workers always say, actually, I love my work. Right? Even those who are working in the least likely places, like cleaning things or doing away the waste or so, most of them say it's surprising. I love my work, and I don't find it amazing because work gives you the sense of self-efficacy. I have a place in the world. I do something that leaves a trace. Right? It's even meaningful in a certain sense, and you get the money from the world. It's like it's the naval cord that connects us to life. But then people normally always, workers almost invariantly add, if I'm led to do my work properly, if I really can connect to it, right? But I'm not led to do it because of, on the one hand, permanent time pressure, and on the other hand, of course, this permanent accountability. Fill that file, do this report, do that report, optimize in this direction, optimize in that direction, and this leads to a sense of total alienation from work, right? So you really see, if you want to have good work, if you want good work in any sense, right, you have to allow for spaces of indisponibility when you don't know what the outcome is, right? The permanent pressure to optimize things is kind of killing resonance.
D'optimisation, et c'est ça qui tue la résonance.
Merci. Et ma dernière question, avant de vous passer la parole. Vous parlez beaucoup dans votre dernier essai de la catastrophe écologique à venir, et vous la décrivez comme une catastrophe terminale de la résonance. Qu'est-ce que vous entendez par là, et êtes-vous pessimiste quant à l'avenir?
Yeah, this is actually this is an interesting question. I mean, when I wrote the acceleration book, I was totally pessimistic, right? Because I thought most likely we will just run faster and faster until the system crashes, and it can crash economically. I mean, that's very easily done, but it can also crash ecologically, or even actually by spreading some diseases, like the new virus in Wuhan in China, right? It can spread very fast. But then I thought that's too pessimistic, and I said, as individuals, we can do nothing, right? Because it's a systemic problem, it's a structural problem. So what should we do? With the resonance book, it had changed, right? It's a much more optimistic book, right? Because I realized, you know what I think? I mean, my claim is that really this logic of speed, right? It's a systemic thing, but the energy comes from us, the individuals, the entrepreneurs, but also as individual private persons, right? We have to provide the desire and the energy. So we somehow have to rethink, what do we really desire? Where do we want to get to? And I think we should not stop at thinking, I desire to be faster, I desire to be number one also, because that is not really, I mean, that's not really a worthwhile goal, right? It's not creating this kind of resonance. So now I somehow think it must be possible, and I think even you see it in the way, in the environmental disaster, right? As I said, it's a logic of increase creates ecological problems, I believe, right? And we will not, I'm really pretty sure, I mean, I'm sure about one thing, we will not solve that problem through technology alone, right? I mean, this permanent increase of speed, of dynamization, right? You see it over hundreds of years. It's the same that with temporality, right? When people discovered they were short on time, they asked for faster technologies. And we deliver on faster technologies. We're faster in transport, we're faster in production, we are faster in communication. But it does not solve our time problem. Not at all. It makes it worse and worse. And it's the same with this ecological logic. We cannot solve it through technology alone, but through a different way of being in and with nature. Right? Nature is not just a realm of resources we can use to do whatever we want. People really need nature. I'm pretty sure about this, right? At least we need some element of nature, right? We can get in resonance with it. It's a sphere of resonance, right? Listening to the universe, and people do it in the forest, in the mountains, at the oceans, when they watch the stars, whatever it is, or some go to the deserts. So there's a certain danger that this gets more and more extreme too. But nevertheless, we need this outer world, we need the space of nature to feel ourselves, to create this axis of resonance. And once we discover that, maybe we'll find the solutions to come just out of the... I think as a society we have to move beyond the system of dynamic stabilization. But yes, I'm optimist because I believe we can do it. It's not a natural law. It's something we have created in modernity, so we can overcome it.
Est-ce que vous avez envie de réagir et surtout de témoigner en vous posant je vous demande de vous poser cette question. Ai-je déjà vécu dans mon travail une situation de non-résonance ou de non-disponibilité? Et je vais vous demander, je vais recueillir 2-3 témoignages et ensuite on demandera à Hartmut Rosa de réagir. Madame, je vous ai vu.
Oui, bonjour. Merci vraiment beaucoup, Monsieur Rosa, pour votre présentation essentielle. Je suis Dorothée Broez. J'ai coécrit avec Jacques Huybrecht le manifeste pour refonder le progrès, dans lequel vos travaux sont largement mis en lumière, ou je dirais dynamisés, avec l'épilogue qui s'intitule « Résonance et communauté de destin ». Personnellement, effectivement, je dirais que l'expérience de résonance, vous l'avez bien expliqué, c'est de se sentir partie prenante, partie apprenante, partie communiante du monde, c'est-à-dire compris compris par un espace dans lequel nous sommes, et donc à la bonne place, j'ai envie de dire. Alors, j'aurais plein d'exemples à donner, mais c'est vraiment l'expérience au travail ou en famille, ou dans la nature, qui fait ressentir ce bonheur. Un bonheur vraiment qui s'impose à vous. Je dirais simplement un exemple. J'ai eu l'occasion de recevoir la médaille du mérite il y a quelque temps. J'ai donc récapitulé ce que j'étais. Et j'ai simplement dit ce que j'étais par les autres, par ce que j'ai reçu à 3 ans, à 8 ans, à 15 ans, et donc avec des expériences précises que les personnes autour de moi incarnent. C'est-à-dire, je suis faite des autres. Et donc, la reconnaissance est donc une autre identité, et une sorte de tranquillité d'identité qui est mouvante. Alors, je voudrais juste poursuivre cette petite chose par une question, parce que ça résonne beaucoup pour moi avec les travaux de Peter Sloterdijk. Parce que ce qui me semble important, vous avez parlé d'énergie, du désir. Vous savez que Bernard Stiegler en France travaille beaucoup sur la négantropie. On sait que le vivant, de manière très surprenante, fabrique une sorte d'opposition à cette diffusion d'énergie vers le chaos, qui est l'entropie. Et donc il y a cette possibilité du vivant de métabolisme qui se fixe dans la matière l'expérience. Donc j'ai repris cela dans ce texte en disant les choses suivantes, inspirées de votre livre Résonance. Ces échos du monde en nous nous informent au sens où ils nous donnent forme, laissant leur empreinte d'émotion ou de compréhension. Ce métabolisme intériorise véritablement les éléments extérieurs comme une respiration. Il grave le monde en nous. Alors, la question est la suivante. Est-ce que nous pouvons comparer ce qui se passe au niveau de notre corps à ce qui peut se passer au niveau d'un corps social? Et j'en terminerai en citant justement Peter Sloterdijk, qui, en 2009, lors de la présentation de l'appel du Collégium, qui était aussi un manifeste, lors du colloque Un monde en sursis.
Excusez-moi, je vais vous demander peut-être de conclure, parce que je pense que vous êtes beaucoup à avoir envie de témoigner, donc allez-y.
Oui, il fait référence à Hans Jonas, mais il termine par agir de telle sorte que les conséquences de ton action favorisent ou du moins n'entrave pas l'avènement d'un système de solidarité globale. Ça veut dire que nous serions capables au niveau social d'inscrire l'expérience comme des organes d'un corps qui se respecteraient, auraient conscience les uns des autres et seraient en coopération.
Merci. On va y revenir. Donc, les deux notions centrales que vous avez évoquées, qui sont la reconnaissance et la question du corps social. Mais je vous propose qu'on recueille 3 témoignages, encore 2, et ensuite, parce que je pense qu'il y aura des choses qui se recouperont dans vos propos. Monsieur ?
Marc Dufresne. Marc Dufresne. Je vous partage un témoignage. Je vais essayer de ne pas la faire trop longue. J'ai eu la chance de partir 6 mois en Afrique, au Togo, au village. J'étais le seul Français au milieu d'un peuple africain. Et j'ai fait l'expérience du temps. C'est-à-dire que j'ai toujours grandi. En fait, on est habitué à avoir le temps qui est au-dessus de nous. En fait, notre vie est guidée par le temps dans sa nature objective, c'est-à-dire qu'il est au-dessus de nous et puis on s'adapte sur le temps. Et là-bas, j'ai fait l'expérience de l'ennui, en fait. De l'ennui. Et c'est quelque chose qui n'existe pas dans cette société, parce que l'ennui, c'est éprouver le temps qui est au-dessus de nous et qu'on ne vit pas en tant que tel, quoi. Et je pense que notre société occidentale, elle a quelque chose de... Il y a quelque chose à faire, et j'y reviens juste après sur ce que peuvent apporter là-dessus les outils technologiques, les outils de communication. C'est en fait simplement se réapproprier le temps. C'est faire nôtre le temps qui est au-dessus de nous. Et en sens, par rapport à la question justement par rapport à la question du sens, c'est une réflexion que je me suis faite là en vous écoutant. Le sens n'est pas accessible au sens. C'est-à-dire que on ne peut pas saisir. Le sens, il n'est pas extérieur à nous et c'est nous-mêmes qui produisons du sens dans la relation qu'on a avec l'autre et dans la relation qu'on entretient avec le monde. Voilà.
Merci.
Et juste, je termine. Et je termine simplement sur les outils de communication. Le temps s'accélère. Le temps s'accélère toujours, et en même temps, paradoxalement, il se fragmente. Et donc, la perception qu'on a de l'avenir a de moins en moins de place, et le souvenir qu'on a du passé a également de moins en moins de place. Et en fait, ça produit de l'instantané, on dit couramment la société de l'instantané. Et à mon avis, il y a quelque chose de très beau qui va pouvoir se passer dans cette société occidentale. Je pense que ça va être c'est l'avenir de la société occidentale, sinon il n'y en aura pas. C'est que cet instantané qui produit pas de sens en soi, en fait, il faudrait apprendre à se l'approprier pour qu'il devienne du présent. Et le présent, c'est le seul lieu où le bonheur existe, c'est le seul lieu où la joie existe, c'est seulement dans le présent où on peut avoir une relation qui soit sincère avec l'autre, qui soit sincère avec le monde, qui dans notre travail soit sincère, où on est complètement soi.
Merci, je crois que c'est clair. Merci. Est-ce qu'on a une troisième Oui. Est-ce que vous avez... pardon. Est-ce que vous avez eu un micro?
Allô, oui. Oui.
Ah, pardon. Vous avez déjà eu le micro. Vous êtes dans l'ordre alors, monsieur.
Oui. Moi, c'est simplement une petite question simple.
Just a quick question, if I may.
Qui résume en fait peut-être tous vos travaux, à savoir sur l'accélération, sur la résonance, et puis le dernier. Et cette question, à mon avis, elle s'adresse à tout le monde. Et je vous la pose. C'est la question de la mise en cohérence. Mise en cohérence individuelle qui va déboucher derrière sur une mise en cohérence collective. Et donc, où est-ce que vous en êtes, vous, sur votre propre mise en cohérence entre vos valeurs, ce que vous aimeriez voir vis-à-vis de ce que vous dénoncez dans vos livres, voilà.
La question de la mise en cohérence, si j'ai bien suivi.
Entre les valeurs et ses actions, en fait.
Entre les, also die Konsequenz zwischen den eigenen Werten und den anderen und dem Kollektiven. Je vous laisse peut-être répondre à ces trois témoignages, peut-être.
Okay.
Si cela vous inspire, sinon.
Yeah, I'll try to be fast, so maybe we can have one or two more. Because I find these very interesting questions. I mean, on the first one, I mean, in sociology, I mean, we are a little hesitant to compare our bodies with the body of society, right? To think of society as a body is a bit dangerous, right? Because then, of course, the idea is that everything has to contribute to a totality, and then there are things which malfunction and so on. So it's a bit. I would be a bit hesitant to think that way. But I totally agree with Bernard Stiegler in Sloterdijk. They are very interesting figures, right? Thinking of this energy and also social energy, right? And how it is directed. And my idea I get actually also when reading Sloterdijk or Stiegler and others, and you said that in a lot of what you mentioned, right? I believe what I'm looking for, what I want to write a new book on, is something in between the active and the passive, right? Kind of being part of something, being connected with something, means that I'm neither totally active nor simply passive. I find it really interesting in our modern languages like French or German. In action, I'm either the perpetrator, the agent, or the victim. But I think there are in the positive ways of being together. It's something in between, like when we do music together. You cannot say who is active and who is passive. It's the kind of in-betweenness that creates community and creates even the action, right? So I really wonder, can we think of even in work and life states of, I call it medial passivity, between the active and the passive, right? Because I believe, just one more thought on this, I believe the problem, what creates so much anger in this society and so much frustration, it's that we always switch between so omnipotence, so to speak. I can do everything, like with a remote control. If you have a good remote control in a room like this, I can make it bright or dark, I can make it hot or cool, I can kind of make it red or green. But if the remote control fails, I cannot even open the door. I'm totally powerless, right? So it's always omnipotent or powerless. And we need to find new ways of being together, of acting together, where we are not only active or passive.
C'est peut-être une notion qui peut aider à repenser la notion, parce que je pense qu'on a sans doute dans la salle aussi des personnes en situation d'autorité, quand on est manager ou subordonné. Est-ce que cette notion de médio-passivité peut nous permettre de penser cela différemment?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. If good management has this sense too, being in it together is not controlling the others and having your, even in a meeting or so, right? It's not a good meeting if you get everything you want, right? It's a good meeting if you feel that you together, the solution is something new. I mean, Hannah Arendt calls this, right? It's the natalité, right? The birth of the new out of a situation where you are together. This is why my notion of self-efficacy is not the psychologist Bandura's notion, where self-efficacy is having control over the outcome. That's I would almost say idiotic, right? Self-efficacy is if you feel that you are part of something that's moving in a good direction. And with the question of l'ennui, Afrique, etc., and the present, I find there are two ways of l'ennui, right? I mean, you can have a kind of resonant way of not being rushed, right? Of being in time. You know, the way we are being and being in time is kind of, as we know from Heidegger, right, are very close. And of course, l'ennui or boredom can mean that you're totally alienated. There's absolutely nothing that speaks to me, right? You find it in literature, for example, right? Bore out. This is why bore out and burnout actually have, they indicate the same problem. There is nothing that speaks to me, nothing where I can experience real self-efficacy, right? So that's why I want to use resonance as the opposite of existential ennui, existential boredom, and existential burnout. It's this medio-passive stance, of course, which we need in between. And for me, it's very important to say the experience of time in resonance is not only being in the present. I really think this is a mistake in some of even the mindfulness movement, right? They always tell you, be totally in the present. I believe, and I've really I thought a lot about this. I'm just right now writing a new article on it. It's the experiences of the good life are those where there's resonance between the past and the future, right? The past memories play into the present experience and they extend into the future. You somehow have the feeling that what you do is answering past experiences, your own and social past experiences, and somehow pointing towards future generations and your own future, right? So it's not cutting off the past and the present that gives you a good life or a good way of existing. It's kind of connecting co-presence of those. And the last question, yes, the coherence. I mean, for me, it's very, very important that resonance is not harmony, right? It's not everyone is the same, or not. It's not even identity, because you also talked about identity. For me, resonance is a state of being and acting where you accept difference. You hear someone, you get in touch with someone or something that speaks differently, and it might even irritate you, right, and confuse you. And you say, oh no, this, for example, in a discussion, you see it very easily, right? It doesn't have to be coherence in the sense of consensus, right? For example, if we talk, right, I say, no, that's totally wrong, but I'm still in resonance. I listen, I try to answer, and you contradict me maybe, and then we move together towards something new, right? So for me, resonance is not affirming identity, just harmony. Resonance is being in touch with some other, right? Something that challenges me. I believe that's true for society and democracy. Yes, there are people who have different beliefs, desires, they love differently, they pray differently, they work differently, and it's not that now I just do what they do. I don't even have to accept it, but I make my own voice heard, and I hear their voice, and when we try to get in resonance, we both move and change. That's why I hope that the resonance conception does not require society to be totally homogeneous or coherent from the start, right? But what we create together is a new state it's a new state of resonance where we can kind of have an interplay of difference. It's not just tolerating that the other is other, but being in touch with the difference of the other.
La relation avec l'autre.
Alors, il nous reste très peu de temps, donc je vais vous demander, voilà, vous deux, peut-être vous deux. Ah oui, non. Et je vous demande une situation précise, un exemple. Voilà, ensuite une deuxième personne.
Merci beaucoup Hartmut et merci beaucoup Anne-Sophie et toute l'organisation. Moi, il me semble que nous allons entrer en résonance quand nous serons capables de contacter la partie féminine du monde, et notamment de laisser de l'espace aux femmes. Et il y a des femmes dans cette salle avec lesquelles je suis en résonance. On crée des cercles de résonance et on organise le 8 mars prochain au Zénith de Paris une grande mise en situation de la résonance. D'habitude, Éclore là propose 100 femmes sur scène, alors qu'habituellement la femme est sans scène. Mais c'est une exception. Et j'aimerais savoir qui est d'accord ici sur laisser de l'espace au féminin. Anne-Sophie, on peut se mettre debout. Et les hommes aussi ont du féminin, je crois. Qui est en résonance avec ce féminin du monde?
Lassen soll für die Weiblichkeit, ob das ein Weg der Resonanz ist.
Alors, ma question précise, Hartmut, c'est pensez-vous qu'effectivement la résonance est plutôt une affaire de femmes ou de féminin? Merci beaucoup.
On est d'accord que vous ne vous sentez pas sous pression et que ceux qui restent assis ne sont pas forcément des tenants de la masculinité agressive. Et est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre souhaite témoigner? Oui, madame. Ah, pardon. Oui, allez-y.
Je vais essayer de le faire très court. En fait, j'ai entendu la question du management et aussi de ce que nous on appelle l'intelligence collective, c'est-à-dire cette écoute, et celle de l'innovation. Or, le paradoxe, très souvent, on est placé dans un espace de production qui doit générer des sprints de création pour arriver à une production. Et ma question, c'est, ne pensez-vous pas que ce qui permet d'être à la fois dans l'espace d'indisponibilité et cet état de poésie que nous devrions tous pouvoir déclarer et de création, donc, tout autant qu'en rapport avec un agenda de production, c'est la relation, la résonance purement humaine, c'est-à-dire la capacité de s'entendre, de s'écouter, de se mettre à disposition les uns des autres, de se réorganiser quand c'est nécessaire. Et en ce moment, il y a beaucoup de conversations, de tentatives d'implémenter des managements agiles, etc. Il y en a qui marchent, il y en a qui ne marchent pas. Et quand est-ce que ça ne marche pas? C'est quand le travail de la symétrie de nos êtres à la raison de notre travail n'est pas fait. Donc voilà, la résonance aussi avec la raison de l'entreprise et puis entre les êtres de s'écouter, simplement.
Das geht darum, also Management, also das Managementverhältnis und wie es darum geht, also vor allem eine menschliche Resonanz aufzubauen in diesem Verhältnis. Je prends peut-être un troisième témoignage. Allez-y, comme ça, parce que je pense je pense que vos témoignages résonnent entre eux. Donc,
je voulais parler de ce sentiment d'accélération et d'aliénation que j'ai vécu à plusieurs endroits avec à chaque fois une recherche de résonance. Alors, ça a été d'abord dans les grands où j'ai vécu ces accélérations du temps, j'ai vécu de devoir produire plus avec de moins en moins de moyens. J'ai vécu ces court termes qui font qu'on perd même le sens du travail parce qu'on est tellement dans l'urgence qu'on en perd le sens. Alors après, j'ai voulu aller dans des petites structures en me disant là, il y aura plus de résonance, plus de liens, plus d'humains.
Towards
et là, on s'est
smaller
avec
companies where I thought there'd be more resonance, more humanity. But then there was another pressure, economic pressure, having to survive, and therefore spending a lot of energy.
Je peux peut-être prendre une seconde pour traduire avant que j'oublie. Sie war in großen Unternehmen und wo es auch sehr viel Druck gab, also über Ressourcen und so weiter, und ist dann gewechselt zu kleineren Unternehmen, wo es aber auch der Druck der Rentabilität Realität gab.
Jusqu'au jour où j'ai compris que tant que je mettais ma vie au service d'une entreprise, même avec du sens, même avec une belle cause, je serais aliéné. Et quand j'ai compris que c'est l'entreprise qui doit être au service de ma vie, ça veut dire que je dois mettre le centre de gravité dans ma vie. Et là, l'entreprise doit être un élément qui me permet. Alors les choses ont changé. Et aujourd'hui, je les amène dans les grands groupes. Je suis consultante et j'aide des gens à faire ce switch, de dire ce shift, de dire l'essentiel, c'est d'abord ma vie et comment l'entreprise joue un rôle dedans et pas moi le rôle dans l'entreprise.
Yeah, okay. Three great questions. Yeah, maybe I start with the last one. I mean, I think everyone would agree generally that of course that the life should be first and the enterprise second, so to speak, right, in the relationship. But then everyone agrees with this and would say, I mean, it's this old discussion whether do we work for life or do we live for work, right? But the theoretical answer and even the best intentions somehow are not enough. I mean, this I find really interesting. We encounter this problem everywhere, right? Everyone, for example, on New Year's Eve, everyone says, yes, let's somehow slow down. It's a good intention. Everyone agrees on it, basically. And then we do the opposite. And everyone says, for 50 years now, we have to do something about the environment, right, to be more ecologically sound. And still, our footprint gets worse and worse. And it's kind of the same situation when you think of the relationship between life and the enterprise, right? And you're right, in small enterprises, it's a bit, sometimes it's more easy, right, to somehow have human relations. But it doesn't work always, right? Even there, the systemic pressures are very strong. And on this, no, I forgot. What was the second question?
J'ai oublié la deuxième question.
Oh, that was your question.
Das Management und das Verhältnis zu den
anderen. I remember. Yeah. I mean, there is actually a problem with. I mean, there is of course a problem that I think there are two answers to this. I think yes, being in resonance in a management group is helpful and is important. But in resonance does not just mean having communication, having more feedback and so on, right? You can have a lot of feedback and a lot of talk without having resonance at all. Therefore, I really find it important. Resonance is it's an attitude, it's a habitus, right? Being, and it means actually, it's a habitual thing. I see it in discussions at my university or so, in teams. There's sometimes you have this very hard, I have this opinion, you have that opinion, and nothing moves, right? So then you can actually talk for hours without really getting in resonance. Resonance always requires listening and answering, the capacity to shift, and sometimes to feel, to hear what is not said, right? So to really connect even bodily. And you cannot always just get this through more communication. That I find really important. Sometimes more communication actually kills resonance, right? Instead of really doing, getting in resonance, we talk more. So that's why sometimes people say, do you mean communication by resonance? And I say no, right? Resonance is a different way of relating. And secondly, of course, resonance is not only on the social level, right? Resonance is also on the material and even in the way a company relates, of course, also to clients, to the environment, right? Being in that's why I always think it's not enough to have resonance with some people. If we say, let's create a resonance sphere in our company and in France, and we don't mind if people in Libya or in Bangladesh die, then actually say, you see in this gesture, I don't care about the refugees. Look at this, right? I mean, it's in my face, it's in my voice, it's in my hand, the closure. I don't want to listen and answer. I want to keep it away. So that's why I believe if you want to have this habitus of resonance, right, it really relates to the whole way of being in the world. You cannot stop at one point or the other. And the question about the feminine I find very interesting. I mean, in the book on resonance, I have a whole chapter, right, on asking is resonance feminine, and actually my answer in some way is yes, but not biologically or physically, right? But in the whole of modernity, I found this really interesting. My claim is that there are two ways of being in the world. One is the habitus of resonance, and the other is which is also important. It's important for us human beings that we have the capacity of what I call a mute relationship with the world, bringing the world in a distance and working on it scientifically or as engineers or technologically. This is important, right? But it's two ways of being in the world, and what modernity has done, it has kind of gendered these two stances, right? The male stance towards the world is the distant, cold, analytical thing. That's why we think, why we say boys don't cry, for example, right? Men are the cold, analytical, even aggressive actors, while women are emotional, sensitive. They do the care work and so on, right? I do not believe that this is in biology. But I think, but at least, I mean, I have no way to disprove it. But as a sociologist, I would not start there, at least, right? But of course, our whole discourse is about women being sensitive. Listening and answering is a kind of it's coded in female terms here. That's why I definitely think, you know, we have not only gendered it, we have said the cold or the distant, the analytical stance towards the world is male, the resonant stance is female, and then we have even hierarchized it, right? The male thing is much better, right? It's the thing we should do. We pay it higher, we have higher social esteem and so on, and this is what has created this conundrum we are in, the bad situation. So I definitely would say yes, let's make the world more feminine, right? But in a sense, of course, which just means let's somehow re-esteem, give new esteem to the what we code as feminine. But I believe it's in men too, right? And it's also men need to rediscover their feminine side, I would say, right? As it is the other way, right? So, but it's true that in our society, resonant qualities are very often attributed to women and also developed in female contexts and not in male contexts.
Je vous préviens pour ceux qui veulent assister à d'autres événements que l'on a dépassé le temps, mais on aurait encore 5 minutes pour prendre deux témoignages, peut-être éventuellement en réfléchissant éventuellement sur l'impact de votre activité aussi dans le monde, hein, puisque, comme vous l'avez dit, Hartmut Rosa, on ne peut pas penser la résonance qu'à l'intérieur d'une structure donnée. Monsieur ou madame, est-ce qu'on a des micros quelque part?
Let's look at the whole picture.
Ah, on a perdu les micros. Il faut qu'on.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. I'm here.
Bonjour.
Oui, allez, merci. Là-bas, madame.
Okay.
So I just had a question on the example you just gave before with Bangladesh and saying you make a space for resonance in one company, but then you close up to something else. My question is, if you transpose this idea to an individual level and you try to be in resonance and welcoming these things from outside, how do you also protect yourself in some way? If you're empathic, if you have empathy, how do you protect yourself from all the, there's the environmental news, there's the social news, so how do you manage this balance?
Les limites de l'empathie et le risque de trop de résonance peut-être. Et est-ce qu'on a un deuxième témoignage? Oui, madame. Vous, je vous ai vu en premier, je crois. Allez.
Bonjour. Vous demandiez des expériences sur l'impact aussi qu'on peut avoir dans le monde en résonance. En fait, le hasard fait qu'il y a 2 ans, avec 2 autres personnes, on a monté une association qui s'appelle le Collectif Résonance. Mais j'ai eu connaissance des travaux de M. Rozak l'année d'après. Et ça marche bien, en fait, on aide les enfants de la protection de l'enfance et d'autres enfants en difficulté à s'exprimer à travers la pratique artistique manuelle et théâtrale, de l'improvisation, du roleplay, etc. Et donc, pour nous, quand on a choisi le nom de Résonance, en fait, c'est parce que pour nous, ces matières-là, justement, permettaient de les faire entrer en état de flow et résonner en eux-mêmes, faire de l'introspection douce. Mais c'est aussi que ça leur permettait d'avoir une voix dans le monde. Et on a beaucoup parlé ce matin du rapport à soi-même, de sa propre vie, etc. Et je trouve que aider les gens à s'exprimer et à faire résonner leur propre résonance interne, je trouve que ça peut avoir un impact fou. Nous, dans l'assaut, on a fait un spectacle pour reprendre les voix de ces enfants et même les mettre sur scène pour ceux qui le voulaient et qui étaient encore là. Et ça les a transformés. le fait de pouvoir s'exprimer devant des gens comme ça, même si c'était juste 50 personnes sur une scène de théâtre, ils sont rentrés en résonance entre voilà, ce qu'ils voulaient sortir d'eux-mêmes et que personne n'écoutait jamais, parce que ces enfants qui sont placés dans des foyers d'urgence, personne ne les a probablement jamais écoutés. Donc, ils s'écoutaient eux-mêmes et ils transmettaient au monde. Et j'ai l'impression que cette résonance, elle était 2 fois plus forte pour eux. Voilà, c'est ce qu'ils nous ont transmis en tout cas.
Et j'ai envie de vous demander qu'est-ce que ça vous a fait à vous?
On a beaucoup pleuré d'émotions. On était en fait, oui, ça nous a le fait d'être le canal de ces voix que notre chargée d'atelier entend à l'année, qu'elle aide à faire s'épanouir. Le fait de voir le public y réagir aussi, en fait, c'est une sorte de triangle vertueux entre ce que les enfants ont créé, ce qu'ils ont sorti d'eux, ce qu'ils donnaient, et la relation au public qui recevait ça 10 fois plus fort que s'il avait lu dans un article. Voilà, donc c'est une sorte de triple résonance, et les enfants, en termes d'impact, nous ont dit que ça il y en a même un qui veut devenir acteur maintenant, alors que il vend un peu de drogue. Voilà. Ça leur ouvre aussi notre croyance d'eux-mêmes, je trouve. Voilà, c'est...
leads to resonance within themselves.
Merci.
Yeah, I find this. I'm very much interested in education, as so to speak, or in the broad sense of education, but also with the arts, theater, and the arts. What you call expression, right? I think it's totally it's a vital element of resonance, of course, because my idea is that. It really resonance means having a voice, right? Making your voice heard, but of course first discover the voice, and it's not just the physical voice; it's also with your bodies, right? In let's say artistic or theatrical play, you feel that you somehow have something to say, and you leave a trace in the interaction with others, right? So I believe what we need to create spaces of resonance, oases of resonance, particularly to give. To give children, disprivileged children, the chance to maybe for the first time in their life, right, discover what it means being in resonance in a group and in the world. But by the way, when I say maybe for the first time in their lives, I think I want to take that back, because I believe resonance is not something which we have to learn in school or somewhere else, right? Kids and human beings are always resonant beings by their very nature. But what happens very often is that we dislearn it, right? It gets lost because, it gets lost either because no one hears you or sees you, right? Or because I undermine your sense of self-efficacy, right? If you feel that what you do is not good enough, right? No one is interested in it or so, right? You cannot express yourself. Then you lose the sense of resonance, and then spaces, if I understand what you said, I think I do. It's recreating that sense in a space of resonance. And on this question of how do we close ourselves off, the thing is, resonance for me is not just being affected, let's say, by the misery of people in Bangladesh or elsewhere. It necessarily entails this element of self-efficacy, right? It is, of course, the sense of connection. I really thought, you started with the 2 women I have in the book, in the resonance book, and the one woman I call her resonance because she loves her work, she loves her family, she loves sports, she feels she is in touch, and so on. And the other woman is always kind of frustrated, right? She hates her work and she thinks she doesn't, she's no longer in touch with her family and so on. And I asked myself, who of the 2 women would probably care for people in Bangladesh? Right? And I decided, because someone said, I'm much more in sympathy with the frustrated women, because in this world, when you know how your t-shirts are produced in Bangladesh, you cannot always love what you do and what you buy and so on. And I think that is true, but I think it needs this kind of resonance stance with your environment, that you have the capacity to say, oh, wait a minute, let's think about what people in Bangladesh do. Let's try to find ways to do something. It gives you a sense of self-efficacy. But my last point point. I thought this sense of self-efficacy does not mean that that I want to be in the omnipotent position. Now I have to change everything, right? That's why I believe the way to somehow connect to people without being so frustrated that you get depression and burnout from empathy is the sense of media passivity. I cannot change the world completely now. And yes, a lot of things that I do are bad for the environment and are not socially fair. But I try my best in every little situation, and I try to be with others and to reach out and to connect to people in Bangladesh. You know, it's this, what I said, I mean, you know, it's like the way we interact with our cars. And a car is a bad example if you talk about the environment, but nevertheless, a lot of people have this experience. 30 years ago or 40 years ago, there was kind of physical interaction with the car which gave you a sense of self-efficacy. You wash it, and sometimes you use the hammer to put in the gear or so, right? You kind of work on it, it gives you a certain sense of self-efficacy, but it was always incomplete. Nowadays, you have the remote control. The windows go down, the windows go up, the radio goes on, the radio goes down. And if the remote control doesn't work, you can't do anything. You cannot even close the window again, right? So I think we should not strive for this omnipotence and do politically everything right. That's probably we can't do it right now. But we get this sense of reconnection. We are in it together. We are working on it. We try to make it better step by step. I think this is the way to not get depressed in a world which is totally imperfect as it is right now. Right? I don't believe that closure is a good idea in the sense of I can't care about Bangladesh. I can't care about the environment right now. This is always a stance of alienation that I believe in the end is not increasing resonance even in our daily life. It's the opposite. It's killing resonance in the daily lives too. That was a very pessimistic note, but I think the idea was optimistic.
Je vous remercie. On pourrait en parler effectivement, comme vous le dites, pendant des heures. Je pense que c'est une notion à explorer pendant toute notre vie. Pour ceux qui souhaitent la revoir résumée en 4 minutes pour revenir à des notions plus prosaïques, vous retrouverez la vidéo ainsi que des analyses du monde du travail et des points de vue tels que celui de M. Rosa sur notre site web philonomiste.com. Je vous encourage à le redécouvrir, à le partager auprès de vos amis, de vos collègues. Et je vous remercie infiniment pour votre présence et pour vos témoignages. Et bien sûr, nous remercions Hartmut Rosa, nous vous remercions pour votre présence, pour votre écoute, pour la façon dont vous avez réagi en pleine résonance avec le public aujourd'hui. Merci.